Hello and welcome back to Fin 340 Real Estate. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 17, which is Lecture 4, Part 1, and it deals predominantly with leases. So in Chapter 17, we're going to go over briefly the leasehold estate, how to create a valid lease, landlord and tenant laws, setting the rents and how that's done, assignments, subletting and termination, and job opportunities in the leasing environment. So, who are the individual parties who are agreeing to lease agreements? There's the lessee, who's the tenant or the renter of the property. They have the right to use that property and enjoy it. And this right is conveyed to them by the lessor. And conveyed is the word to mean that there's a transfer of rights. They are allowed to take possession of the property, and they have to make sure that the property is in good use. So when the lessor, the landlord, retakes possession of the property in what's known as a reversion, they're able to either release it or sell it if they would like in good condition. If the lessee does not maintain good condition, then the lessor can sue the lessee to repair damages to those conditions. A very key distinction here as to use of security deposits. Okay? A lot of you have leases on your personal apartment buildings. But a security deposit cannot actually be used by the lessor without informing the lessee of the deductions that would be applied to the security deposit. And technically speaking, the lessor is supposed to sue the lessee for use of the security deposit. The security deposit is supposed to be returned to the lessee immediately. In the state of West Virginia, it is now 45 days. At the termination of the lease, and they must provide a documented list of items which need to be repaired using the security deposit of the lessee. They are then to sue the lessee for deliverance of that security deposit back to the lessor in the amount of the money. Okay? So a common thing that landlords will do is they prey upon the lessee's lack of information here. And they will just simply take money out of the security deposit and call it a day and give the remainder back to the lessee if there is any at all. But unfortunately, the law says the money must be returned to the lessee, and the lessor must sue the lessee to make good on the balance that is owed. Okay? So you may be able to get your security deposit back and then say to the landlord, if you want me to repair anything, you have to give me a documented list and technically take me to court. And that's actually true. I have on 2 occasions now got security deposits back where the landlord did not want to provide it to me, and I simply cited the West Virginia state law. This was changed, I believe it was 2012, actually by a few West Virginia University students who were upset with how landlords in the Morgantown area were dealing with their tenants, particularly with respect to security deposits. They got the security deposit time return reduced significantly to that 45-day window, and the requirement that the landlord actually provide an itemized list and sue the lessee for the return of the funds that were used to repair the building if needed. They also got some items that were thrown out that you could not claim were going to be covered by the security deposit that commonly landlords would do. Such as light bulbs. So landlords used to say, if you don't replace the light bulbs, we're going to take the cost of new light bulbs out of your security deposit or take a large portion, far more expensive than the light bulbs would cost. So they got some pretty good controls on what was allowed to be taken out of the security deposits. And that occurred for the entire state of West Virginia. So they took it right to the legislator in West Virginia, and it was approved as state law. Now, the lessor, as we've just been discussing, is the person who owns the property and allows the lessee to use that property. And the lessee is going to provide rent to this lessor, which is their consideration in the agreement. Once the lease is done, the landlord will take back possession of the property under the period known as a reversion. And the whole idea behind this agreement is that the landlord will convey rights of property possession to the lessee, and the lessee will provide rents to the lessor. Okay? And provided that the lessor has done their job correctly, they're going to charge rent, which will compensate them for, 1, the use of the property, okay? 2, the incremental damages that occur from simply inhabiting the property. So over time, the property is going to lose value, it needs to be maintained, and simply having somebody living in the property is going to cause fair use or normal wear and tear, okay? And the rent is supposed to be calculated to incur these damages onto the lessee immediately. So if the landlord expects to incur approximately $1,000 of depreciation of home value due to maintenance and wear and tear per year, they would want to take $1,000 divided by 12 and add that onto the rent amount that they will charge the lessee. And this will compensate them for incremental damages. It does not compensate them for damages which are significant, such as the lessee blasting through a wall in a drunken party, and they just damage the drywall. That's not a normal wear and tear. Normal wear and tear is where you have lived in the property for, let's say, 5 years, and the backsplash is covered in a little bit of oil. Okay, that's normal wear and tear. Blowing through the wall because you were in a drunken stupor is clearly not normal wear and tear. Other things that are considered normal wear and tear, calcification deposits on fixtures in the bathroom is pretty normal, and that is not something that the landlord typically is allowed to recuperate from you. Although you should clean it, you can just use some TLC or TLR spray or calcium spray to get rid of it. You can do it yourself, and that'll reduce the risk that your landlord will basically break the law and try and get the money back from you. Because remember here, the landlord themselves are not lawyers all the time. There are sometimes they're lawyers and they know the law pretty well, but it's often the case the landlord is not a lawyer, and they may be breaking the law and trying to recuperate certain funds from you for things that are normal wear and tear. So if you know the law, you can say to the landlord, this is normal wear and tear. I am not responsible for this. In the lease agreement, it says normal wear and tear is acceptable. So just recently I moved out of an apartment, and I had been in there for 5 years, and the landlord said, oh, well, we will have to charge you to repaint the apartment. And I said, no, you won't. I have done no damage to the walls. I have not put nails in the walls. The walls are somewhat dirty from normal wear and tear. They were not actually that bad at all, but the landlord wanted to charge me to repaint the walls. And I said, absolutely not. That's normal wear and tear. Okay. So these are things that you can fight against, and the landlord ended up losing. They knew they were not going to be able to take me to court, and I would win on that claim. But what they were trying to do was to prey upon a renter who doesn't know their rights. Unfortunately, I know my rights, okay, and you should as well. So make sure you are fighting against landlords who are trying to take advantage of you in these cases. And the other thing that they will be included in the rent is the risk against other damages or the failure that you are going to not perform in your duties as the lessee in paying the rent. So let's imagine that the landlord leases the apartment to an individual who has a very stable job and is able to make rent for 8 months. And then they lose their job and they don't have enough savings to make future rent. It is a good idea for the landlord to build in a little bit of padding in the monthly rent payments for the case that they would actually have the tenant not be able to make their rent payments. And that will help protect them against any tenants who have to leave in the middle of the lease because they're unemployed, etc. Okay? Now, the way you do that is you make sure that the rent is above the balance that you're going to pay on the mortgage if you are the landlord. So if you buy a house and your mortgage is, say, $800 a month, you would charge maybe $1,000 a month, which provides you $200 of leeway in case the lessor defaults on their agreement. And only over a certain period of time can you recuperate what might have been the last few months of rent, okay? So that will help defray the cost of tenants not paying what they're supposed to pay and moving out of the apartment early. It'll help defray the cost for incremental damages and also for the use of the property, which is the whole point of renting to begin with. Okay, so that's the general idea behind a lease agreement. The lessee takes possession of the property, the lessor gets the rent, and they have an agreement to uphold either end of the bargain. Now, creating a valid lease is just like any other contract. It is a conveyance of rights to possession in due consideration of money, monetary value, being changed hands, which is the rent. Okay. However, there are a few items that need to be listed in the lease agreement for them to be valid. First and foremost, if the lease will be a year or more, it cannot be an oral agreement. It must be written down. So that's very key here. It must be in written form. And it usually has to be typed nowadays. Handwritten leases are no longer accepted. Okay? They have to be typed. And they're going to require the names of the lessee, the lessor, and oftentimes any aliases that the lessee or lessor have gone under. You might also want a doing business as declaration for the lessor if you are unsure of whether their formal corporate name is the name that they typically do business under. And you want a description of the property that will be leased. Typically for apartments, this is just what address do we have, and that's enough to identify what apartment you're in. If it is a larger property, you may get all the ways into that bounds and meets that we discussed at the very beginning of the semester. You will list a conveyance agreement, which says that the property is going to be provided to the tenant, and here are the rights which are being conveyed from the landlord, typically just possession. Okay. An indication of how rent is to be paid. This one is pretty interesting. I have seen these get fairly creative, particularly by landlords who are a little bit selfish. If you have a nice landlord, this will be payable via credit card. Okay? Why do I say if you have a nice landlord, it'll be payable by a credit card? It seems strange that I would want to pay rent by a credit card, but think about it this way. One of your largest annual expenses totaled up is rent. Okay? Maybe $12,000, $15,000 on average per year. That's, depending on the credit card you have, about 30,000 points, which is a full international trip abroad to the Pacific or the Atlantic if you're going to use fly mile points, or a lot of other expenses. You would make that expense anyway, and if you simply put it on your credit card and then pay off the credit card, you get points for making a normal expense in your everyday life that you're going to have to incur. So that's a really nice landlord. And today there are lots of online systems that are built by the landlord in order to help these sort of ideas along, okay? Make things easy for everyone involved. However, you can also have the case where the landlord is a little bit mean. And what they do there is they require that you write a check, and when you use a check, they will charge you for that check. I've seen that several times. So they charge you a check processing fee, and they offer no other means of paying for your apartment than through paying for a check. And the check processing fees are simply not limited. Okay, they can be as high as $50 if they would like. Okay? And there's no legal recourse for you to say, hey, that's illegal. You can't charge me $25 to process a check. Because they are a private business, they can do that if they would like. It is a bad business practice, and I ask you to read your lease agreements for anything under the indication of how rent is to be paid, where the landlord says, if you pay by check, we will charge you a check use fee or check deposit fee. Okay? That is where they get a little extra money out of you, and maybe $25 doesn't seem like a whole lot of money. That's just going out to eat in today's world, but that adds up over time. Okay? You will be paying $275 more per year simply to pay your rent. I'm sorry, $300. I did the math wrong there. Okay? $300 more per year simply to do your rent. Okay? And that's quite a large expense. So make sure you're looking at indication of how to pay. The dates of the lease agreement have to be provided as well. Obviously, you move in on this date, the lease begins on this date. You move out on this date, the lease ends on this date. Okay? That's just to keep everybody understanding when the lease starts and ends, and obviously if we're going to enter into tenancy in sufferance, which we discussed before, but is also mentioned in this chapter, it begins the tenancy in sufferance on the last day of the lease agreement. And finally, of course, like every other contract, you're going to need signatures of the parties in agreement. However, on this sort of contract, a lease agreement, a signature by the landlord and the lessee is sufficient, provided there is a exchange of funds, typically the security deposit, that is verifiable. And that's one reason you might have to use a check. Typically, you must use a check for the security deposit, but you don't need to use it for the rent itself. When you provide the security deposit and you sign the agreement, consideration has been given, and we do not generally need anybody to witness the agreement for it to be valid and enforceable. So provided you provide that signature and the payment, it's good to go. Okay, so under current laws, we try to interpret lease agreements by the letter of the law, and contracts are generally enforceable provided they don't have any clauses that are illegal in them. But the court will usually use a strict interpretation of the laws and the agreements and the contracts, and they will enforce the leases as they are written in most cases. And this is used predominantly to support landlord rights and allow landlords to buy property and then rent them out and be protected against tenants who want to not pay and or leave. However, most legislatures have agreed and understood that landlords are in a position of significant power. And in order to kind of skew the balance of power back in favor of the tenants, or the people in most cases, they have set several laws which do the following. They limit how high security deposits can be or must be. So this is usually set at 1 month's rent. Usually, in many states, I've never seen it higher than 2 months' rent. It's the highest I've ever seen it. But 1 month's rent is usually where it's set at. What the landlord can use your security deposit for, and often you will see in the lease determination itself, the lease agreement, they'll say your security deposit cannot be used for the last month's rent. And that's because the law says it cannot be done. Okay, so they have limits on what they can use security deposits for. There's a stipulation on the tenant side as to how many days they must give the landlord notice that they're no longer going to enter into a periodic lease. So remember, a periodic lease is one which automatically renews itself on a standard 1 year, 5 year, 10-year basis. Okay, it is not a lease for years which stipulates this is for 1 year and is renewable only upon re-sign. Okay. The landlord must provide notice on the dates that are on the agreement as well. Okay, so the landlord has to provide notice ahead of time if they're going to make evictions or they're going to make any changes, and if they're going to have the tenant move out of the property for construction, etc. So these are all protections for the tenant and also for the landlord. You should read through the landlord and tenant laws in your book, and you should also read through on page 294 the lease agreement that's in your book. It lists pretty one by one lines. What are the components of the lease agreement? It doesn't really make sense to go over them with you here. So just read through each of those lines and familiarize yourself with those items. That is just a template lease agreement. They are far more complicated than the single page document that is in your book. They usually last many, many, many pages. And be also aware that any documents which are attached to the lease agreement are also valid to the lease agreement. And these are usually considered homeowners' rights or apartment procedures and guidelines. These are all affixed to the lease and are considered part of the lease. So if you get apartment guidelines, then those are usually considered part of the lease. They're not separate documents and they're absolutely enforceable. Setting rents. There are 3 methods for setting rents in rental agreements. One is the gross lease, the next is net, and the last one is the percentage lease. There's another one called the index lease, but it's not common to a huge extent, so we're only going to talk about these 3 here. The gross lease is one where the tenant pays a fixed rent, and this is the most common. Then the landlord is going to deal with all of the operating expenses which are incurred on the property. So if there's property taxes, maintenance fees, expenses, so the landlord has to mow the grass or fix the easement rights of the road, the driveway, prune the bushes, etc. Okay, repair fixtures in the apartment. That under a gross lease, the tenant's not going to pay for those. They will only pay the fixed amount of rent, and the landlord has to deal with everything else. Obviously, this leads to lower income for the landlord, but it will usually increase the likelihood that the property will be rented because tenants are not in the position to pay for expenses which are not easily conceived of. So they're not thinking ahead of time and going, well, I need to make sure I can provide for maintenance costs that the landlord may incur. They want a fixed rent agreement. So using gross leases lends itself to having higher rates of rents. Net leases are where the landlord uses what's called an escalation in order to appropriate certain expenses that he incurs onto the tenants. So an increase in property taxes, so they get a new appraisal and the property taxes go up as we discussed in the prior chapter, they would like to pass those on to the tenant. Under a net lease, they can use an escalation to do so. Okay? They say, oh, property taxes have gone up. It's gone up by $35. I'm going to, if they've got 10 tenants, I'm going to increase everyone's rent by $3.50. That is an escalation. And they can do this for maintenance or other items. Another way of doing this, landlords will do kind of a mixed gross or net lease, and this is predominantly in the commercial real estate side. They will give a fixed rent amount and then a common area maintenance expense known as a CAM, C-A-M. The common area maintenance expense is a floating expense that increases or decreases depending on the maintenance cost that the landlord incurs. In this region of the United States, the common area maintenance expense is used to cover the cost of maintaining the grounds through landscaping and also clearing the grounds, parking lots mostly, of snow. And the common area maintenance expense can skyrocket in the winter. Many times, lessees come and enter into lease agreements during the summer. It's very easy to enter into lease agreements in the summer. That's when most people begin businesses and enter into leases. That's also when most people buy homes, so just keep that in mind. They will enter in during the summer and enjoy pretty stable rents. So they get a fixed rate of rent and low CAM expenses because landscaping is not that expensive relative to snow removal services. Then down the line, January comes along and there's a blizzard. And the snow removal service, because the landlord does not want to get sued for cars parking on the parking lot and then maybe having an accident, they use the snow removal service of a private contractor 3 or 4 times a day. And it's not uncommon for a common area maintenance expense to go up to thousands of dollars in more rents. So your rent may be $5,000 a month, and the CAM expense is another $4,000 in the month of January. Doubling your expense usually does not help the bottom line for most businesses. It is particularly bad in large anchor stores. An anchor store is where a landlord in a commercial real estate lot has a large warehouse store and then several other stores in the area, which are usually smaller. They may be large chains or they may be mom and pop. Common anchor stores are, well, they used to be Sears. That was a very common one. Walmart is a pretty common one now. Target, okay, large selling retail stores that everyone knows are called anchors. The anchors typically negotiate fairly low common area maintenance expenses for themselves. And what the landlord does is to replace those common area maintenance expenses on the smaller tenants, because the smaller tenants are in less of a position to negotiate with the landlord than the large anchor store is. Remember, the landlord wants Walmart in there because it brings everybody to that location, who then buy goods from the smaller renters. So it's a very good idea to have Walmart there. But to get Walmart there, they negotiate low expenses for Walmart and replace those expenses on everybody else who now have to incur those costs. The unfortunate aspect is the Walmart parking lot is huge. Everybody else's section of the parking lot is tiny, and yet everybody else ends up paying the cost of shoveling out Walmart's parking lot. So there's an example for you of common area maintenance expenses under escalations, which make net leases not really a viable use for many small businesses, but which they're forced into because there's nothing else they can get. So be very careful if you're going to lease property. Make sure you check the CAM and be under no idea, even if the landlord says, oh, the CAM's not that expensive, maybe $1,000 a month, okay? Don't fall for it. They have no reason to tell you that it's going to be super expensive in the winter, and it can be, and you have no recourse. How do you deal with the landlord who wants to have a CAM expense? Just lock them into a fixed CAM, okay? So you can lock in, you can come in and say, I would like a fixed rent. And they say, okay, it's going to be fixed rent and you're going to owe 15% CAM. You say, no, I will pay you fixed CAM. The landlord will probably be taken back, but they might, depending on how many renters they have in that unit, that property, they might be willing to enter into that fixed rent agreement. Even if nobody else in the property has a fixed CAM contract, you can negotiate that fixed CAM. Remember, these are not preset contracts. You can negotiate almost every single item of the contract. And don't be afraid to walk away. The landlord needs you more than you need him. There are many landlord areas around, and especially in commercial real estate, you can get a place to rent, I guarantee it. So just let them know, I'll go next door. I don't need you. You need me. You have 3 places which are not rented on this property. If I come in, it'll bring you down to 2, which will also help bring other people in. Okay, it's called cross-marketing. So be very upfront with the landlord. Don't be afraid of them. They're usually not as powerful as they lead on until you sign the lease agreement. Okay? Another item that I've seen in many commercial lease agreements is the percentage lease. And this is pretty devious. From the landlord's perspective, it's pretty good. It can be nice in some ways. It can be very damaging in others. The percentage lease says that the rent is charged based on a percentage of the total receipts that the tenant earns. Remember, total receipts is a SEM word for sales. It does not mean net profit, it means sales. Okay? So let's say that you opened a small nail salon, okay, and a commercial real estate property, and you're making $400,000 a year in sales, and the landlord's percentage lease agreement says they get to take 20% of that. Your rent just became $80,000 per year, which is actually not outrageous for a commercial operation. But had you agreed to a fixed rent agreement at perhaps a lower rate, you may have ended up at a better position than you were. What's the benefit of a percentage lease? Well, if you don't end up having that much sales at all, then your rent is only a fraction of your sales receipts, and it pretty much ensures that you're not going to default on your rent. If you make 0 sales, your rent is nothing. If you make $200,000 in sales, it's a percentage of that. If you make $1 million in sales, it's the same percentage of that. So it helps stabilize the percentage of your receipts that your fixed expenses are going to be for your business. Okay? Another way of saying that is it increases your degree of operating leverage. It makes a fixed portion expense into a variable expense. Okay? Okay, I'll say that again. It takes a fixed expense and makes it a variable expense. Remember, variable expenses are expenses which increase with the quantity sold. In this case, it's actually sales dollars, which is a function of quantity sold. Okay? So keep that in mind. It can be useful if sales are low, rents are low. However, on the other side, if sales are high, you end up paying a high percentage of rent, and you don't get that benefit from having high operating leverage if you had a high or low fixed rent. Okay, the fixed part being important there. So this would be very lucrative for landlords, particularly if the business is good. And they will think ahead of time when they see this. They say, oh, this is a really good business idea, or they've seen this business before. They will try to get you into entering a percentage lease. If you are a first-time franchisee, be very weary of percentage leases. Often the landlord will say to you something along the lines of, hey, look, you're a first-time business owner. I want to help you out. Would you enter into a percentage lease? It's going to keep the rent low while your sales are building. The unfortunate aspect of that is that percentage lease agreement is probably 5 to 10 years long, and your sales will build over 2 to 3 years and you'll be done. You will not experience substantial sales growth after 2 to 3 years. You'll have matured. But he will get to enjoy the same stable percentage of your sales receipts for the entire remaining 5 to 10 years. Okay, in subletting and termination, you can sublet your lease agreement or assign it. In an assignment, what you're doing there is actually providing the lease transfer of rights completely to another individual. So you're no longer going to be the leasee, you're going to give it to someone entirely different or an entirely different entity. This is generally known in today's parlance as subletting, although they're not the same thing. A sublet is where you remain the leasee of the contract, but you allow someone else to take possession of the property or enjoy your rights in the lease. But you still remain obligated to the landlord, you don't transfer that obligation, and you still have possession rights. The sublet is somebody who is below you. So they answer to you and you answer to the landlord. In a sense, you become the landlord of the sublet, and you have a landlord on the property itself. Because of this multi-step hierarchy, many lease agreements do not allow you to enter into sublet agreements because basically you've just increased the potential that a risky individual will take possession of the property and potentially activate squatters' rights on the property. And the landlord has no interest in allowing that to happen. They would prefer that you assign your rights to another individual whom they agree to allow the assignment to occur. So subletting is usually disallowed in most lease agreements. But if it is allowed or your landlord says it's fine, you can go ahead and do it. But be aware that under a true sublet, you remain obligated to the landlord. Which means that even if your sublet is paying the landlord directly, under a sublease agreement, if they stop paying the landlord, you are then obligated to pay the landlord, even if you don't live in the property anymore. So always make sure you're not doing a sublease, but you're doing an assignment of the lease if you want to get out of it. Okay? Very important distinction there. Okay, three main types of evictions. An actual eviction is when the landlord or the tenant actually violates parts of the lease agreement and the landlord says, you have violated key components of the lease agreement, please leave. This is typically done when the tenant does not pay their rent or they do something illegal on the premise. This is very common, particularly when the landlord does an on-site maintenance call or inspection and they smell, for example, marijuana. That may immediately initiate an eviction notice. The reason the landlord wants to do an eviction notice when they have some sort of illegal activity, one, they can get fined by the local government for allowing that activity to go on, and two, they may be able to recuperate damages from you and then lease out the property again simply because you breached the agreement. Okay, there may be a breach of agreement clause which allows them to recuperate damages, and if they think the market is hot enough they could release it easily fairly quickly, then they'll be able to make out by doing the actual eviction on illegal use within the premise. Okay? Or not paying the rent is a little bit of a different deal, but illegal use on the premise, they can actually make money on that if done correctly. So be careful of what you are doing in your safety, quote unquote, of your own home. Constructive eviction is when the landlord does not maintain the premises of the property or some event happens and it makes the property uninhabitable, but the landlord does not act to make it inhabitable again or transfer you to another property in which you were able to live in a habitable fashion. The tenant's only recourse here is to leave the property, claim they have been wrongfully evicted, even though they were not actually evicted, but claim that they have been effectively, constructively, okay, constructive here means effectively, evicted, leave the premise, and sue the landlord for damages. And that will allow them to get money back and make the landlord maintain the premise if they were smart to begin with. Retaliatory eviction is where the tenant perhaps makes a claim to the local health department that the landlord is not maintaining the premise, there's black mold, there's a sewer backup, okay, things that are pretty damaging to health. They make a claim to the local health department to come and investigate the landlord, and in retaliation to the tenant for making these complaints, the landlord evicts them. Okay, they just say, please leave the premise, you have violated the lease by making a complaint. Even though it seems like something heavy-handed that the landlord could possibly do, it is absolutely illegal. You cannot also, for example, in the same idea there, if an employee complains, in a business, then they also cannot be fired. For example, if they complain to the labor department, you cannot fire them for that complaint. And in the same way here, the landlord cannot just evict the tenant because they've made a complaint. That would be a retaliatory conviction, and it is illegal. Okay. So the last items we're going to go over here are some job opportunities that the individuals who are acting in the leasing environment can do. So you can be a certified property manager, which is an individual who receives a designation from the Institute of Real Estate Management, IREM. And this designation says that the individual has gone through some courses and training in how to manage properties. So how to make sure that the property is completely rented out, dealing with tenants, signing leases, creating leases, and maintaining the property. In the case of an accredited resident manager, this individual is in charge of managing apartment buildings. So you've got lots of residents in the apartment building. They're going to handle that sort of thing. And this accreditation is also given out by IREM, but again, it's particularly only for the apartment buildings. And then a real property administrator is given out by the Buildings Owners and Management Institute, or BIME, which is for management of commercial real estate property. Okay, so very large property, again, those Walmart sort of deals that we were talking about before. That's a real property administrator. A real property administrator has a very different job from a certified property manager. A certified property manager is in that residence sort of idea where they're going to be renting property for the living and residential use, whereas the commercial is much more about making sure that those properties are completely rented and that they are maintained so that retail can go on. Okay, so there's a bit of a different gig there. The real property administrator often spends much more time than the certified property manager in maintaining the property because everything has to look particularly nice. The certified property manager may have some duties in maintaining the property, but will spend most of their time dealing with leases and constructing them with tenants and then dealing with tenant complaints. So there are two different jobs there. The pay can be quite good depending on the size of the building. For certified property managers, they can make upwards of six figures. Real property administrators can make much more than that depending on how many properties they're managing and the size of those properties and the sort of stores that they're able to construct. I have also seen, similar to real property administrators, they also call them portfolio managers, which is a nice little word for that, where they manage multiple properties. They're doing the job of a real property administrator, but they're managing multiple properties. So not just one mall, but 4 malls in a region. And they're making sure that each mall has the right tenant in that mall, and the cash flows from each of those malls are producing substantial amounts of money to pay off any commercial mortgage-backed securities that are on the property. And that's managing a portfolio of assets, if you will, and that's why they're called a portfolio manager of real estate. So a real property administrator can be extended to multiple properties, and you get a little bit more money for that as well. Okay, next time we will go over Chapter 24. Thank you. Have a good day.